A rising star of the GOP, Karoline Leavitt, accused Jasmine Crockett of corruption. The Texas powerhouse struck back with an $80 million lawsuit. What started as political theater spiraled into a reckoning over lies, accountability, and the price of reputation. Their confrontation turned into a test for Congress, the media, and the nation itself. When the smoke clears, who will pay for crossing the line? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The congressional chamber was locked down like a war zone. Metal detectors beeped, guards lined every corner, and beyond the heavy doors, reporters screamed for a glimpse of the storm inside. The overhead lights burned too bright, turning the polished oak table into a stage. Every second felt wired with danger, as if the whole country was holding its breath. One wrong word here wouldn't just echo in headlines, it could end careers, drain fortunes, and rewrite the rules of American politics. At that table sat Karoline Leavitt, only 28, the GOP's rising star, once celebrated as Trump's youngest press aide. She looked every bit the part, sharp blazer, steady voice, but her future trembled under an $80 million defamation lawsuit. Ambition had carried her fast, but now it threatened to crush her even faster. She fought to hide the fear in her eyes, the fear of losing everything before her career had truly begun. Opposite her was Jasmine Crockett, 43, congresswoman from Texas. Former civil rights attorney, the woman they called Velvet Steel. Her posture was relaxed, but her gaze was lethal, calm, cold, surgical. Crockett wasn't here for theater. She was here to draw a line in history: no more lies without consequence. Outside, cameras rolled. Online hashtags exploded. Inside, the silence was brutal. This wasn't a meeting. It was an execution waiting to happen. The chamber was locked down, but the story that dragged Karoline Leavitt into this room had begun 3 months earlier, under the merciless lights of Fox News. It was prime time, the kind of hour where reputations are made and destroyed in seconds. Leavitt leaned forward, eyes locked on the camera, and dropped the line that would explode like a grenade across America. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett has repeatedly diverted funds meant for her district's infrastructure to personal projects benefiting her donors. The words hit like bullets, calm, deliberate, but fatal. To viewers, it sounded like revelation. To Crockett, it was an unforgivable strike. The clip didn't just air, it detonated. Conservative outlets looped it again and again. Talk radio hosts screamed it until their throats went raw. By midnight, headlines blared accusations of corruption. On television screens across the country, Crockett's name was paired with images of cracked bridges and empty construction sites. In Facebook groups, memes spread like wildfire, painting her as the congresswoman who robbed her people blind. The narrative hardened overnight. Crockett was corrupt, and Leavitt was the young crusader who dared to expose her. But Crockett was not built to roll over. She didn't tweet a denial. She didn't call into MSNBC or release a slick video rebuttal. She chose a weapon sharper than words, the law. Weeks later, she strode into federal court with a filing that shook Washington, an $80 million defamation lawsuit. The document was hundreds of pages long, and its intent was unmistakable. Crockett wasn't just fighting for her name. She was declaring war. "You came for me with lies," she told reporters outside the courthouse, her voice steady, her eyes like steel. "Now you'll pay for it." The political world split down the middle. Republicans raced to Leavitt's side, thundering that the lawsuit was censorship in disguise. "This is an attack on the First Amendment," one congressman barked live on Fox. Commentators framed Leavitt as the victim, the young truth-teller, punished for daring to speak against the establishment. On air, Leavitt herself clung to her talking points. "This isn't about me," she said firmly. "This is about protecting every American's right to speak truth without fear." But when the cameras cut her, mask slipped. Her hands shook. Her voice cracked. Democrats, meanwhile, hailed Crockett as a warrior who had done what others lacked the courage to try. To them, the lawsuit was historic, a moment where consequences finally caught up with political smear campaigns. On MSNBC, anchors practically celebrated. "This is the line in the sand," one declared. Editorials praised Crockett for putting truth on trial, calling it a turning point in the fight against disinformation. She wasn't just a congresswoman anymore. She was the face of accountability, a symbol that lies once unleashed could no longer go unanswered. And in the middle of this firestorm was Leavitt, 28 years old, too young to have enemies this powerful, too ambitious to admit how terrified she was. Her career barely out of its cradle now stood inches from the grave. Behind closed doors, she thought about the student loans still hanging over her, the parents back home who read every headline. The more she told herself she hadn't lied, the less it sounded true. Every interview, every headline, every news cycle pulled her deeper into quicksand. For Crockett, the case was more than vengeance. It was a principle, a mission carved from years of watching truth suffocate under the weight of propaganda. She believed this lawsuit was bigger than herself, that it could reset the rules of American discourse. But to Leavitt, it was survival. One verdict could mean financial ruin, political exile, the obliteration of her future. What had begun as a single soundbite had mutated into a war of annihilation. Two women locked on opposite ends of the battlefield, one armed with the fury of youth and ambition, the other with the precision of experience and law. The GOP called it tyranny. The Democrats called it justice. Millions of Americans sat frozen in front of their televisions watching the stakes climb higher by the hour. And beneath all the noise, a single truth reverberated. This was no longer about words. It was about survival, and only one of them would walk away unbroken. The storm outside now shifted inside behind closed doors. The doors shut with a heavy slam, sealing the chamber off from the chaos outside. It was no longer a room in the Capitol. It felt like a bunker, a battlefield disguised as polished mahogany and glass. Three mediators sat stiffly at one end, their faces tight with unease, as if they already knew they were walking into a war they couldn't stop. On one side sat Karoline Leavitt, just 28, her career bleeding out in real time. On the other sat Jasmine Crockett, 43, her reputation scarred, but her presence colder, sharper, like steel drawn from a sheath. The silence itself vibrated, stretched taut, waiting to snap. Leavitt stood first. She gripped her prepared statement like a lifeline, her knuckles pale against the paper. Her voice started steady, every word practiced. Congresswoman Crockett, I regret the words I used 3 months ago. They were based on reports that have since been questioned. I am prepared to issue a public retraction and apology on the same network where the statement was made. She exhaled, forcing calm. To the mediators, it sounded like contrition. To Crockett, it sounded like theater. Crockett didn't blink. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze drilling into Leavitt. A misunderstanding, she said quietly, each syllable sharp as broken glass. This was not a stumble. This was not a slip. You stood before millions of Americans and accused me of corruption. That wasn't an accident, Ms. Leavitt. That was a weapon. And you fired it at me. Her words hit harder than a shout. The mediators flinched as if struck. Leavitt's throat tightened, the page trembling in her hand. Marissa Washington Crockett's attorney broke the silence. She slid a folder across the table with deliberate calm, the sound of paper scraping wood echoing like a blade unsheathed. Here are our terms, she said. A full apology, not on one network, but 3 Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC primetime. Written apologies in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and your local paper back home. $5 million directed to infrastructure in Congresswoman Crockett's district, and a binding pledge that you will never again comment on her handling of district funds. Each word landed like a hammer blow, unrelenting, final. Richard H. Leavitt's lawyer nearly jumped from his chair. $5 million. For one statement, that is outrageous, completely unreasonable. His voice cracked with indignation, but his eyes betrayed panic. He had seen demands before, but nothing this lethal. Leavitt stared wide-eyed, her mouth dry, her entire body frozen. She had expected anger. She had expected hard terms. She had not expected annihilation written in ink. Crockett's reply was colder than ice. Unreasonable. Do you know what was unreasonable? Watching trust evaporate overnight. Watching donations vanish. Watching constituents call me a thief because you want a soundbite. Her voice rose only slightly, but the fury inside it rattled the room. You aim to end me. Don't cry foul now that the cost is yours to bear. One of the mediators raised a hand, his voice trembling. Perhaps there's a compromise. But Crockett's glare silenced him mid-sentence. Leavitt leaned forward, desperation breaking through her mask. Congresswoman, please. I understand you're angry. I understand your pain. But $5 million would destroy me. I'm asking you person to person to reconsider. Her voice cracked on the last word. For the first time all night, she wasn't a political star or a GOP darling. She was just a young woman begging for her future back. Crockett rose slowly, gathering her papers with surgical precision. She looked down at Leavitt, her tone like a verdict. You should have thought about consequences before you spoke. Words have weight. Sometimes they crush the one who throws them. The silence that followed was suffocating. The mediators exchanged frantic glances as if reaching for exits that didn't exist. Then came the dagger. Crockett paused at the door, her voice calm, almost casual. We have polling data showing how much support I lost in my district. We have fundraising records proving the damage. And we have communications suggesting your team knew those claims were false before you ever went on air. The words detonated like explosives. Leavitt went white, her breath catching. Her lawyer stammered, "That's impossible. We've seen no such communications in discovery." Washington's reply was smooth deadly. You will. We filed a motion to compel the evidence your side conveniently withheld. And with that, Crockett walked out her team, following, leaving only silence and ruin in her wake. The mediator sat frozen and Leavitt remained at the table. The walls closing and the weight of doom pressing down like stone. This was not negotiation. It was execution dressed in legal robes. The echoes of Crockett's last words still rang in Leavitt's ears long after the chamber doors closed. That night, in a cramped office stacked with cardboard boxes of discovery documents, her world tilted. The mediator's polished voices were gone. Reporters were still howling outside. Inside, the only sound was the shuffle of paper and the pounding of her own heartbeat. She had demanded answers, but nothing could have prepared her for what the file on the desk contained. Read this, a junior associate said, sliding a folder toward her. His voice was flat, cautious, as though even he feared what was inside. Leavitt opened it with shaking hands. The first page was a transcript of text messages. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the words. Researcher. We don't have a solid source. It's just a blog. No confirmation anywhere. Producer, no time to change course. Karoline's already prepped. Just tighten it. Say reports indicate. Researcher, should we leave the qualifiers, at least mark it unconfirmed producer? No, cut the hesitation. It needs to land as fact. The room seemed to tilt sideways. Her breath caught. The briefing sheet she had read before going on Fox, the one she had trusted, wasn't a mistake. It was sabotage. Doubt had been stripped away, deliberately, qualifiers carved out with surgical precision until lies looked like truth. Someone hadn't just handed her bad information. They had handed her a loaded gun and told her to pull the trigger. Her voice cracked as she whispered almost to herself. They set me up. The words hung in the air like smoke. Her attorneys shifted uncomfortably, their eyes sliding away. No one disagreed. No one tried to soften it. The silence was its own confirmation. She shoved the pages back across the desk, her palms damp, her heart hammering. This proves I didn't lie, she said, her tone rising frantic. They knew it wasn't verified. They erased it and gave it to me. They used me. The anger in her voice curdled into despair. She thought of her parents in New Hampshire, faces lit by television screens as pundits branded their daughter a fraud. She thought of her name once whispered as the GOP's future now spat out like poison. Richard H., her lead counsel, leaned forward. His face was hard, his voice merciless. Karoline, listen to me. The law doesn't care. You said it. You were the one on camera. You were the weapon they chose and you fired. The courtroom won't punish the producer. It will punish you. His words were blunt, but they pierced deeper than any insult Crockett had thrown. She felt like she was falling airless, clawing at walls that didn't exist. So what am I supposed to do? Her voice broke, desperation cutting through. Just let them destroy me for something I didn't even know. Her knuckles whitened as she clenched the edge of the desk, her body trembling from the pressure closing in on all sides. Richard's voice was like a blade. You have two choices, he said, raising two fingers. First option, fight. Deny everything. Tell the jury you acted in good faith and hope they believe you. Pray that Crockett's lawyers slip up. He leaned closer, his stare heavy. Second option, confess. Admit you were misled. Admit you should have checked. Put the blame on your team. You'll still get hurt, but at least you might survive. The words hit her like a death sentence. She shook her head, tears glistening, but refusing to fall. If I confess, Fox will bury me. The party will call me a traitor. My allies will turn their backs. I'll be finished. She swallowed hard, her throat raw. If I don't, Crockett will bury me herself. Either way, I'm dead. Her lawyer didn't flinch. Welcome to politics, he said. There are no clean exits, just the one that leaves you breathing. Leavitt stared down at the printed messages again. The producer's words burned like a scar. Cut the hesitation. It needs to land as fact. She felt the walls closing in the air, growing heavier. She was no longer the golden star of the GOP. She was ammunition, spent, discarded, and left to rot. The office buzzed faintly with fluorescent light, but to her it sounded like a ticking clock. Every second dragged her closer to ruin. She pressed her palms flat on the table, willing herself not to break. But the truth was merciless. The world didn't care who doctored her notes. The world cared about the face that spoke the lie, and that face was hers. The ultimatum still echoed in her head: fight or confess. But Karoline Leavitt didn't wait for permission. The next morning, before her lawyers could cage her, she summoned the press on her own. No one expected it. No one believed she would dare. Yet by noon, the briefing room was packed wall to wall, cameras aimed like rifles, microphones bristling like bayonets. The air felt charged, as if the entire nation had gathered in one suffocating space to witness either her rebirth or her execution. When she entered alone, the room froze. No lawyer at her side, no staffer to shield her, just a 28-year-old woman walking into a storm that could shred her career to pieces. Her navy dress was plain, almost severe, as if chosen for battle rather than beauty. She gripped the podium with both hands, knuckles, white eyes, glassy under the merciless lights. For a heartbeat, silence ruled. Then she spoke. 3 months ago, I stood on national television and accused Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of diverting public funds. She said, her voice low but steady. She paused, let the cameras zoom in. That accusation was false. I was wrong. Gas cracked through the press corps like gunfire. The scratch of pens stopped cold. Reporters glanced at one another, stunned, mouths half open. No one in Washington confessed like this. Not live, not raw, not without a safety net. I take full responsibility, she pressed on, her voice climbing in strength. I should have verified. I should have asked harder questions. I did not. For that, I apologized directly, publicly, to Congresswoman Crockett and to the American people. She leaned closer to the microphones, her tone hardening like steel. But there is more you deserve to know. My team altered my briefing materials. They deleted warnings. They removed words like unconfirmed and unverified. They stripped doubt away and handed me certainty. I repeated it, and in doing so, I became their weapon. That was manipulation. That was wrong, and I will not stay silent about it. The room detonated. Reporters leapt to their feet, shouting questions over one another. Are you accusing Fox of directing this? Who doctored the notes? Were you forced to lie? The noise roared like a riot. Camera bulbs popped in her face. Leavitt stood frozen at the podium, unflinching, her chest heaving, but her gaze fixed straight into the camera lens, as if she were daring the entire country to watch her bleed. Her phone buzzed on the lectern. A single text lit the screen. You just shot yourself in the foot. Richard H., her lead attorney. She didn't pick it up. She didn't even blink. She gripped the wood tighter, ignoring the lawyer who had warned her, ignoring the voices that told her to hide. For once, she had nothing left to lose but the truth itself. Within minutes, cable networks cut live. Anchors stuttered through breaking coverage. Twitter caught fire, spitting out clips and hot takes faster than they could be read. Half the country was aghast, declaring her career over, finished before 30. The other half marveled at the audacity. Was this ruin, or was this courage? In living rooms across America, the debate lit like gasoline. One viewer muttered at his TV, "She's toast." No one survives admitting they lied. Another whispered, almost in awe, "That's the bravest thing I've seen in politics in years." Friends argued in coffee shops, families clashed at kitchen tables. To some, she was a coward, unraveling under pressure. To others, she was a martyr for accountability. Back in the room, a veteran reporter whispered to the man beside him, "She just burned her career alive." The other shook his head slowly. Or maybe he said she just started something bigger. Leavitt closed her notes, her voice lowering for her final blow. I was wrong. I own it. Whatever comes next, I will face it. No dramatics, no tears, just a verdict she pronounced upon herself. She stepped away from the podium, ignoring the hailstorm of questions and flashes behind her. Each click of her heels echoed like the tick of a clock, counting down to judgment. She didn't wait for applause, there was none. She didn't wait for forgiveness, none was promised. She walked out alone, leaving behind an empty podium and a media world in shock. On television, anchors scrambled for words. On social media, America split into warring camps, half crowning her courageous, half condemning her as finished. And in that brutal divide, one truth stood tall. Karoline Leavitt had lit the fuse on her own political career, and the explosion would echo for years. The fallout from Leavitt's confession hadn't even cooled when Jasmine Crockett stepped into the blinding lights of a press hall across town. No notice, no leaks, just an unannounced appearance that snapped networks into chaos. Producers barked into headsets, anchors stumbled over filler lines, and the press corps surged forward like a tide. When she reached the podium, silence dropped heavy like a curtain before an execution. Crockett clasped her notes, then raised her eyes to the sea of lenses. I heard Ms. Leavitt's statement. She began, her voice low but charged, each syllable carrying a blade. It takes courage to admit fault in front of the nation. I acknowledge that. The room seemed to exhale for a moment, as if mercy might follow. But then her tone dropped, her gaze hardened. An apology, she said, pausing so the words hit like gavel strikes, does not erase consequences. Reporters froze. Pens halted midair. A camera flash burst like lightning and then stopped. Crockett's voice filled the vacuum, cold and deliberate. 3 months of damage do not vanish in 3 minutes of remorse. Reputations shredded trust. Stolen integrity smeared it. Doesn't reset with a sentence. Every word slammed down like iron doors closing, leaving no escape. She lifted a single sheet of paper from the lectern. The shuffle of the page sounded louder than it should have. Accordingly, she continued, I am revising my demand. Damages will not be $80 million. They will be $10 million. A murmur ran through the room. Some reporters gasped, others frowned. But then she cut them off with the blade of her voice. And it will not come from Ms. Leavitt personally. Her eyes locked on the cameras, her jaw set. It will come from the network that broadcast her words for profit. The amplifier, not the pawn. The silence was deafening. This was no retreat, it was a redirection, a strike at the heart of the machine that had fueled the smear. Shock rolled across the press gallery. One reporter whispered, she just moved the target. Another replied, she just escalated the war. But Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned forward, both palms flat against the podium, her posture like a prosecutor laying down evidence. There is one more condition, she said, her voice dropping into a lower, lethal register. Ms. Leavitt will not walk away untouched. She will join me in a public initiative to reform political media. Reporters erupted, questions, shouted, voices clashing, but Crockett raised a hand and the room fell into silence again. Verification before accusation. Corrections delivered with the same reach as the lies. Transparent sourcing, mandatory disclosures, and training for every paid voice that steps in front of a camera. She held the silence for a beat. If you want the megaphone, you accept the harness. Debate may be fierce, but it must be factual. The press corps leaned forward like witnesses to a verdict. Some scribbled frantically, others simply stared, stunned by the audacity of turning a lawsuit into a blueprint. Is this punishment? One reporter finally shouted. Crockett's eyes flashed and she delivered the line without hesitation. It is not punishment. It is repair. It is deterrence. It is the price of weaponizing falsehood. Another called out, so the 10 million is symbolic. She cut him off mid-sentence. It is enough to sting. It is enough to stand. It is a figure every boardroom will remember when they choose profit over truth. Her words didn't rise. They didn't need to. The menace was in the calm precision, in the certainty that this was no bluff. Crockett gathered her notes, then looked up one last time. Her final words landed like a hammer. Apology acknowledged. Consequences preserved. Target corrected. Reform required. She stepped away from the podium, leaving microphones hissing, anchors scrambling for words, and a press corps frozen in disbelief. As she exited, the image burned into every screen, Jasmine Crockett, walking away, not as a victim, not as a politician seeking revenge, but as an architect of reform, turning a defamation war into a battle plan to rewrite the rules of political speech. And in that moment, even her critics knew the game had just changed forever. The roar of cameras still echoed across Washington, but in a back corner of the Capitol, silence ruled. Crockett's office was dim blinds drawn the air heavy with anticipation. For the first time since the scandal erupted, there were no microphones, no flashing lights, just two women about to face each other without an audience. Leavitt stepped inside her pulse, hammering her palms clammy. She had walked into ambushes before, but this felt different. This was not politics anymore. This was survival. Crockett sat behind her desk, a fortress of papers in front of her. She didn't look up right away, letting the seconds stretch until they turned cruel. Finally, she raised her eyes and spoke. Sit. The word was simple, but it carried the weight of command. Leavitt lowered herself into the chair's spine, stiff, trying to mask the tremor in her hands. The quiet pressed down until Crockett broke it, her voice low, measured, almost surgical. I'll be honest with you, she said. When I first heard your words on Fox, I wanted to end you. Not challenge you, not out-argue you. End you. I wanted your career buried so deep no one would even remember your name. Her stare was unwavering, sharp as a blade. Leavitt swallowed her throat dry, but forced herself to hold the gaze. I believe you, she said softly. I saw it in your eyes, and I knew I deserved it. Her voice wavered, then steadied. But I also knew hiding behind lawyers would make me a coward. That's why I confessed. It wasn't strategy. It was the only thing I had left. Something flickered across Crockett's face, not softness, not forgiveness, but recognition. She leaned back, folding her arms. You stood up and admitted what most in this town would rather choke on than say. That doesn't erase the damage, but it tells me you're not beyond redemption. Her tone was still iron, but for the first time the iron wasn't pointed like a spear. She reached into a folder and pulled out a document. The title in bold letters seemed to hum with power, The Crockett-Leavitt Standards for Political Communication. Crockett slid it across the desk, the paper whispering across the polished wood like a challenge. Look at it, she said. Leavitt glanced down, stunned to see her own name paired with Crockett's. She read the bullet points, her chest tightening. Fact check before you accuse. Reveal sources. If you're wrong, correct it with the same fire as the original attack. She looked up wide-eyed. You're serious. Deadly serious, Crockett replied. She leaned forward, voice cutting each word clean. This city runs on words. Those words can build or they can destroy. You of all people know that now. This she tapped the paper is the start of fixing it. Leavitt hesitated. And you want me to sign this, not just sign, Crockett said sharply. Stand beside me. Co-founder, you build it, you sell it, especially to your side of the aisle. They'll listen to you in ways they'll never listen to me. Her eyes narrowed. You are not here as my victim. You're here as my partner. If you have the courage to confess, then prove it meant something. The words hit like a challenge she couldn't refuse. Leavitt thought of the jeers online, the allies abandoning her, the weight of betrayal she carried. But here in this room was a chance to forge meaning from the wreckage. Slowly she nodded. I'll do it, not to save myself. To prove the truth matters more than spin. I broke the rules. I'll help write better ones. For a long moment they stared at each other. Then Crockett extended her hand across the desk. The gesture was stark, deliberate, charged with history. Leavitt froze her breath, caught every nerve screaming with memory of everything that had passed between them. Accusation, lawsuit, confession of fury. Finally, she reached out. Their hands locked. The handshake was firm, unflinching, electric. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a pact forged in fire, an agreement hammered from ruin. Two adversaries who had tried to destroy each other now clasped hands as partners in reform. The air in the room shifted, thick with the weight of a moment that would be remembered far beyond the walls of the Capitol. When they let go, the silence was different, not hostile, not heavy, but charged. They had crossed a line that few in Washington dared to cross, turning war into alliance. The battle scars remained, but the ground beneath them had changed forever. And then they walked out together. The hallway footage crashed onto every screen at once, two figures, shoulder to shoulder, heads high, no handlers, no guards, just intent, and an undeniable truce with the cameras. Editors froze the frame on the clasp, zoomed the nod, replayed the pivot toward the lenses, until the 6-second march felt mythic, larger than politics. Anchors lowered their voices as if the building itself were listening for a verdict that might reset the rules. Producers built split screens, slow-motion cuts turning a corridor into a stage, and motion into meaning, beat by deliberate beat. By nightfall, that silent walk had swallowed the news cycle, crashed onto home screens, and set the tone for everything that followed across the country. Newsrooms shifted into emergency mode. Morning shows tore up rundowns. Evening programs stacked new panels. Late-night studios went live without jokes or music, letting the tension breathe. Phone screens lit up with the same image and 100 captions, each one claiming to know what the walk meant. Truce traps surrender, Gambit a deal struck in fire. Clips multiplied, stitched, reframed, slowed, annotated and argued over in the space of a single scroll and a held breath. Comment threads boiled, part awe, part rage, part relief, as if the country had been holding its breath and finally let it out in a sharp shout across the map. The first internal memos landed before dawn. Networks announced strict visible fact-check protocols, double sourcing for on-air accusations, pre-segment verification grids, and hardwired unverified chyrons no producer could kill or bury in a corner. Standards teams suddenly had teeth. Sloppy scripts came back scored with red lines, timestamps, links, and editors' notes that demanded proof or silence. If a guest leveled a charge, control rooms demanded receipts before the next block. If none appeared, the line died on the cutting room floor, and the guest did not return. On-air corrections were ordered to match the original blast, same hour, same show, same reach, no hedges, no excuses. In studios where speed had always beaten caution, checklists began to glow brighter than countdown clocks and commercial breaks. Universities felt the tremor next. Law schools printed the filings, the transcripts, the negotiation notes, and stamped them into thick case packets that smelled like new ink and trouble. Clinics ran simulated hearings while moot courts drilled the difference between opinion, inference, and allegation, then forced the advocates to argue the other side. Seminars mapped the timeline, broadcast backlash lawsuit, confession pivot, and asked the hardest question: who pays when speech becomes a weapon and the wound is public? Professors assigned essays on remedies and restraint. Journals opened rapid symposia. Guest lectures filled to the door's hallways, buzzing long after the bell. Across campuses, the case turned from scandal into curriculum, from headline into doctrine, from gossip into law. For Karoline Leavitt, the bill came due in days. Bookings vanished. Old allies stopped replying. One donor texted only, "You made us bleed," then blocked her number. Commentators on her own side tagged her a traitor, and the word stuck heavy and hard to wash off, repeated until it felt branded. But a new crowd stepped out of the noise independents, tired of theater campaign veterans, burned by spin-young staffers who respected the risk of saying, "I was wrong," without a script. Invitations arrived from unexpected places: community forums, podcasts, town halls where the first question was not a knife, but a hand. She walked into those rooms without makeup or armor, answered plain, and found nods where she expected stones, brief claps where she expected boos. Jasmine Crockett's rise was different, quieter, heavier, inevitable. Profiles called her the woman who redefines political ethics, and it landed because the rules were already bending around her. Networks booked her not for fireworks but for standards. Committees asked her to draft them and then to enforce them. In interviews, she spoke without swagger: verify before you accuse, correct with equal reach, disclose what you know and what you don't, and the phrases traveled from segments to scripts. Audiences didn't chant. They listened, then stood as if a code had been read aloud and adopted. By week's end, the image of those two rivals walking a single line had become more than footage. It was the baseline everyone used to measure the new day now. The corridor handshake faded from screens, but its shockwave kept traveling, tightening every newsroom and committee room in the country. 6 months became 12, and the Capitol learned a new reflex: pause before you speak, then verify before you breathe. In green rooms, producers drilled guests 3 times on the same claim, searching for receipts, not rhetoric. Veteran pundits slowed their cadence eyes, flicking to notes that suddenly mattered more than swagger. Junior staffers whispered, "source or strike," and older bosses stopped laughing at the phrase. The mood wasn't timid, it was armed caution, the kind that comes after a close brush with ruin. On-air talent felt at first the way pilots feel new turbulence before passengers do, and they adjusted with military precision. Hosts rehearsed disclaimers the way they once rehearsed punchlines, learning to separate inference from accusation with surgical lines. According to documents we have reviewed replaced, everyone knows, and the air itself seemed to thicken with restraint. Political surrogates asked for prep calls and then requested copies of the prep, afraid of landing on the wrong side of the ledger. Producers adopted a count-to-5 rule before greenlighting any explosive statement, waiting for proof to appear or silence to prevail. The thrill didn't vanish. It simply moved to the moment a claim survived the gauntlet. The platforms followed with switches and gears the public could finally see, not just invisible knobs behind the curtain. Unverified claim labels began to glide onto posts, mid-scroll stark and calm, a quiet stop sign that demanded evidence. If the user tapped the banner, a prompt appeared. Provide source documentation or edit your statement with upload slots and examples. Content flagged as unverified lost algorithmic lift until proof arrived and appeals had a clock, a ticket, and a clear trail. Video players added a corner badge that pulsed when a speaker left the factual runway, linking to context in a side panel. No one liked being slowed, but everyone understood why the brakes were there. Public opinion hardened into something unusual for a country so divided: consensus with teeth and numbers that didn't wobble. National polling stabilized around a single figure: 78% of Americans wanted stricter fact-checking before broadcast or boost period. The split cut across party, age, and region, a rare supermajority in an era allergic to agreement. Town halls filled with questions not about ideology, but about standards and applause met phrases like documented evidence. One elderly caller told a radio host, "I don't mind waiting 30 seconds for truth," and the switchboard lit up in agreement. Patience, once a media liability, became a civic virtue people were willing to practice in public. Karoline Leavitt returned to a microphone carefully, not as a combatant, but as a builder of guardrails. She launched Verified, a podcast that opened every episode with the same promise. "We will check first, and if we're wrong, we will correct loud." Early shows dissected famous blunders, replaying the moment the train left the tracks and the steps that could have stopped it. She interviewed editors who killed stories, lawyers who saved them, and whistleblowers who wished someone had listened sooner. Critics on her old flank called it penance dressed as programming, but a new audience found the discipline compelling. The numbers weren't explosive. They were steady, like a metronome you learned to trust. Jasmine Crockett moved in a different arc, upward and inward onto the dais, where rules are drafted and hammers fall. The House named her chair of a subcommittee on public communications ethics, and the hearings felt more like flight checks than theater. She began each session with the same line: "We are not here to muzzle speech. We are here to measure it." Witnesses brought playbooks, run sheets, and time-stamped rundowns. Staff counsel traced how a sentence traveled from whisper to chyron. Recommendations turned into guidelines, and guidelines hardened into procurement standards for public contracts and sponsorships. The center of gravity shifted from outrage to operations, and few noticed until the noise stayed lower. Culture picked up the signal and repackaged it, as culture always does when something real lands hard. A streamer released a lean documentary about the lawsuit, the confession, and the pivot, framed like a heist gone moral. Late-night shows ran sketches where punchlines only landed after a visible fact-check ding, making the laughter feel oddly earned. Film rights triggered a bidding sprint, and Netflix openly courted a limited series with reporters playing themselves against a timeline that refused to blink. The phrase "fierce but factual" showed up on mugs in writers' rooms and backstage on cue cards. Even satire sharpened, suddenly precise about the difference between absurdity and allegation. Law schools made permanence out of velocity, binding the case into syllabi, thick with footnotes and cross-examinations. Clinics staged simulations where students had to argue both sides of a retraction request and then draft the retraction itself. In seminar circles, someone always asked who pays when harm is viral and repair is linear, and the room hushed. Journals stacked symposia exploring damages that measure trust, not just dollars and remedies that travel as far as the wound. Professors gave extra credit for corrections written in the voice and volume of the original error, same show, same slot, same push. The exercise felt less like punishment than training for high-altitude speech. The broader world learned, sometimes painfully, what words really cost when they leave the mouth and enter the bloodstream. A rumor is free to launch, but not free to land. The landing always cracks something reputation, commerce, sleep. Words are cheap to speak and expensive to repair, became a line quoted in boardrooms and break rooms, half warning, half prayer. Accountability didn't feel like a guillotine anymore. It felt like a harness that let power sprint without trampling. Leavitt's arc showed that responsibility can be survival, not surrender, if you catch the truth and carry it yourself. Crockett's arc proved that consequences can teach as much as they deter, especially when they aim at the system, not the scapegoat. 6 months on then, 12 the new habits stuck the way safety rules do, after a near collision, quietly, thoroughly, beneath the noise. In control rooms, producers touched laminated checklists like pilots run hands across switches, then nodded to roll. In studios, guests brought folders as armor, not props, and discovered confidence lives where certainty is earned. In classrooms, students argued for standards they once mocked, surprised to find discipline could enlarge the space for speech. And in living rooms, people noticed that the pace felt different, less whiplash, more clarity. The story still thrilling, but now survivable. The handshake had started a storm. The year that followed built a shelter big enough for the next one. A year after the handshake, the city moved like a machine that had learned restraint, and then the announcement hit. Producers dropped everything as a joint press conference was scheduled with 30 minutes notice at the Capitol Media Room. Crews sprinted cables across the floor, lights hissed awake, and security funneled a crowd that felt equal parts hopeful and wary. The doors opened and both women appeared side by side, unhurried, aligned, and absolutely silent as they reached the podium. What followed was not a reunion stunt, but a measured escalation that had been building for 12 disciplined months. Crockett spoke first, voice low and certain, as if reading the operating manual for a new engine. "We are forming a bipartisan political action committee to confront disinformation at scale," she said, letting each clause settle. She called it the Fierce but Factual PAC, designed to fund standards training and visible correction systems that match the reach of error. Grants would prioritize local outlets and live formats, where damage spreads fastest and corrections usually arrive last. Every contract would require transparent audits, so the watchdogs could be watched and the receipts could outlive the headlines. Leavitt stepped forward, next calm, but unsheltered, and owned her place on the stage without excuses. "I was wrong in public, so I will fix it in public," she said, the room tightening at the clarity. She outlined a commentator's pledge document before accusation, disclose influences, and correct with the same volume as the attack. A national registry of corrections would timestamp fixes and push them to the same feeds that carried the original blow. "Speed will not outrun proof here," she added, "and silence will never bury a correction again." She reminded the room that humility is measurable when you publish receipts and invite others to test them in daylight. Then they delivered the sentence that had become their joint ground rule and their litmus test. "We do not need to be the same in politics. But we need to be the same about the truth," Crockett said, and Leavitt echoed it exactly. The line was short enough to memorize, firm enough to measure, and clean enough to travel without spin. Phones rose as one capturing a phrase that sounded like a door locking on reckless speech. Even skeptics wrote it down the way you copy instructions before stepping onto dangerous ground. The questions started hot, and the answers came with the same steel they had practiced all year. "Is this censorship?" someone shouted, and Crockett shook her head. "We fund standards, not silence," she said, pointing to open audits and published protocols instead of black boxes. "Can partisans enforce anything together?" another asked, and Leavitt said, "Trust the rules set, not our moods." They did not trade barbs. They traded documents, and the room adjusted to the new gravity. The press found itself adjusting less to spin than to the presence of evidence at every answer. Outside that room, the image traveled faster than the words, and the reaction hit in waves. Morning shows built special segments around the joint pledge, and evening programs led with the contract language on screen. Clips were replayed in slow motion, not for drama, but to show how the two paused after the sentence on truth. It looked like discipline, not theater, and audiences could feel the restraint through glass and pixels. No one announced a truce, they demonstrated one. Within weeks, the passee's skeleton turned into muscle visible enough for critics to swing at and sturdy enough to hold. Newsrooms requested training modules that mapped how a claim should move from whisper to broadcast without losing verifiability. Live desks piloted a mobile verification team that could chase down documents while a panel kept talking. On-screen banners gained a permanent unverified state that could not be overridden without uploaded evidence. Every grant included a clause requiring primetime corrections that mirrored the original segment's reach. It was slower than outrage and far more durable, a scaffold instead of a spark. Law schools bound the year into casebooks and mock hearings, but this day became the capstone lecture. Clinics assigned cross-examination drills that forced students to argue for standards they personally disliked. Seminars asked the same question again and again: who pays how much, and how far should repair travel? Panels answered with the new blueprint: the issuer pays in money, the carrier pays in reach, and both pay in time. Students left carrying rule lists that read like flight checks for high-altitude speech. Professors noted how restraint, when formalized, could widen debate instead of narrowing it. Culture did what culture does when something hard becomes real enough to film and easy enough to quote. A documentary framed the arc like a heist reversed at the getaway car, with the loot returned receipt by receipt. Writers' rooms stapled fierce but factual to corkboards as a joke that kept refusing to be funny. A streamer circled a limited series ending not with handcuffs, but with a newsroom training day. Even satire adjusted landing sharper because it labeled absurdity without pretending it was allegation. Memes tried to flatten it and failed because the plot twist was responsibility, not a punchline. Writers learned that accuracy could carry tension all by itself when the audience knew the stakes and could see the files. Through it all, Crockett's profile settled into something heavier than celebrity and steadier than outrage. Reporters began calling her the architect of accountability, the person who converted anger into operational rules. Committees trusted her to chair hearings where answers required timestamps, emails, and chain of custody notes. She visited stations that had once scorched her and drilled live repair rehearsals without humiliation. Her symbol hardened the lawmaker who turned fury into reform and made it stick. Leavitt took a different path, narrower at first, and unexpectedly durable as months passed and tempers cooled. Verified, her podcast opened each episode with the same promise and closed with the week's loudest correction. She invited people she once would have debated to the death, then asked them to show their documents. Callers asked brutal questions, and she answered without armor, leaving the mistakes in the tape. Her symbol clarified the rising star who fell, stood back up, and used the fall to build guardrails. The audience grew smaller and stronger, a crowd that prized receipts over rage. Back at the podium, both leaned into the theme that moved the hall from admiration to commitment. Crockett said anger is a tool until it is a fire, and a fire until it is a structure. Leavitt said failure is a bruise until it is a lesson, and a lesson until it is a next step. They were not trading slogans. They were naming the journey that had brought them to the same table. The hall answered not with cheers, but with pens scraping, which is how policy begins. The operational plan landed next, clear enough to grade and tough enough to test. A bipartisan advisory board would set quarterly benchmarks, publish audits, and referee disputes in the open. Local news would receive first funding with strings-attached source logs, correction mirrors, and whistleblower hotlines. A public dashboard would display error rates and repair times by outlet, updated like a scoreboard everyone could see. If grants were abused, the clawback clauses promised to bite loudly and on camera. Reporters pressed on money, and the answers stayed boring on purpose, which was exactly the point. There were caps for donors, bans on corporate intermediaries, and a wall between fundraising and standards enforcement. Budgets and audits would post on a rolling basis, with caches preserved for anyone who wanted to compare. The PAC would take small checks gladly, and giant checks never, and neither woman flinched at the rule. Boredom, they argued, is the smell of clean governance. When the last question died, they returned to the line that had threaded the entire year, in this new start. We do not need to be the same in politics. but we need to be the same about the truth they said again, sharing the words like a shared oath. Crockett stood as the emblem of fury guided into a blueprint, the engineer who makes heat useful. Leavitt stood as the emblem of failure turned into a platform, the survivor who makes scars instructive. They left together down the same long corridor, and the cameras followed because that is what cameras do. Staffers kept pace without cutting between them, as if the air itself wanted to preserve the symmetry. Outside, the light thinned into gold, and the crowd split into talkers and listeners, both unusually quiet. No one pretended they now agreed on policy. Everyone understood they now agreed on ground rules. The day ended not with victory music, but with a checklist, a pledge, and two steady silhouettes heading for work. The city exhaled not in relief, but in readiness for the work the pledge demanded. The cameras dimmed, and the crowd's roar thinned to a hum. The work of meaning had to begin somewhere. In classrooms across the country, the case became a living lesson, not a dusty precedent, and students leaned forward. Professors rolled in carts with binders, played the clips, and asked blunt questions that stung and clarified. Where did the claim start, who amplified it, and who paid a professor would say, tapping the board like a metronome. First years argued standing up hands gripping folders, while the upper-class moot court dissected broadcast scripts like surgeons. Law felt less like memorizing rules and more like measuring damage in real time with names, timestamps, and consequences that breathed. Workshops replaced lectures in the second month, and the energy shifted from theory to muscle memory. Teams mapped the route, a sentence travels from whisper to chyron, then marked every checkpoint where a safeguard should snap tight. A student producer practiced saying, "We do not have it yet," until the phrase sounded strong instead of timid. A student advocate rehearsed, "We correct at equal reach," like a promise he intended to keep under fire. When the bell rang, nobody packed up fast. They stayed to trade checklists the way athletes trade drills. Guest speakers flooded schedules, and the halls filled with the strange mix of adrenaline and humility that follows a close call. A network standards editor walked through new checklists, admitting where old habits failed and why the new ones could not bend. A civil rights lawyer traced damages that are hard to see, naming the cost of sleep, trust, and time, and the class quieted. A veteran anchor told them, "Courage is not the moment you accuse. Courage is the hour you correct." The note-takers stopped chasing quotes and started recording steps, how to prove, how to repair, how to do both on deadline. Young politicians found their way onto campuses, and the tone was different from tours built on applause lines. They stood at podiums with no teleprompter, fielded forensic questions, and left with notebooks full of changes to their comms plans. One student asked, "What will you do the next time a staffer hands you a script that feels too sharp?" The answer that landed was plain: we hit pause, ask for proof, and if it is not there, we step off camera. They did not cheer, they nodded because the rule was hard enough to be believable. Law review editors crafted symposiums that read like flight manuals for risky air, and submissions poured in. Essays measured equal reach remedies, weighed platform duties when amplification is monetized, and proposed damages that track lost trust, not just lost cash. A dissent argued that sunlight must remain brutal, but even that essay conceded the need for visible correction mirrors. The debate stretched late, yet it felt constructive, held together by a single agreement. No one wanted speech smaller. They wanted the floor under speech stronger. For the young, inspiration arrived as instructions dense enough to hold when nerves wobbled. They learned that courage requires receipts and the backbone to accept a loud correction without curling inward. They learned that accountability can be a clean word when matched by a fair process and a clock. They watched Leavitt say, "I was wrong," and saw a door open that had looked sealed, then watched her keep it open with work. They watched Crockett aim fury at systems instead of throats, and they studied how to aim that way. Beyond campuses, another audience kept their arms folded until proof came to find them, middle-aged men who had seen cycles. They remembered empty promises and cable brawls, and the years when apology meant exile, not repair. They listened anyway, measuring the pitch against the weight of mortgages, payroll, and hard mornings. "Talk is cheap," one told his friends, "but truth saves you money." The line ricocheted through union halls, VFW bars, small-town diners, and office kitchens where coffee tastes like patience. Messages to them were written without perfume or pity because they have no patience for either. Crockett faced rooms full of crossed arms and said, "Anger is a tool. Use it to build standards." Leavitt faced rooms full of raised eyebrows and said, "Pride means taking the hit when you earned it." They did not sell forgiveness. They sold rules that keep the next guy from getting flattened by a rumor. Slowly, the arms uncrossed, not because a tribe had won, but because a process had earned oxygen. Some nights those men watched with their grown kids and argued softly about penalties, repairs, and line calls. They recognized themselves in the insistence on receipts and the refusal to mistake noise for work. They taught their sons and daughters that loyalty to truth will outlast party, that a clean correction beats a dirty victory. Hold your ground, but don't hold a lie, one father told a kitchen table, and nobody laughed. Respect sounded like a sport played by adults again. Meanwhile, the new pack built trainings that looked like drills, not seminars, because muscle learns faster than memory. Volunteers ran on-air simulations, practiced stopping false claims at the first checkpoint, and rehearsed live corrections without flinching. The curriculum was blunt: verify before accusation, disclose sources, mirror the corrections, reach log the proof. People sweated under lights and stumbled and improved and tried again because practice turned fear into calm. In every session, the line between courage and caution stopped looking like a fight and started looking like form. The broader lesson hardened into a story shape that even skeptics could carry without feeling sold. It said power without restraint will cook the truth. Restraint without courage will starve it. Only both together can feed the country. It said free speech is a highway, and guardrails let you move faster, not slower, because you stop dying in the curves. It said the cost of reckless words is paid in trust, and trust once broken bills interest with brutal consistency. It said accountability is not a guillotine. It is a harness built to let speed and safety coexist. Students distilled takeaways on whiteboards that became snapshots, then stickers, then notes above desks. Show your sources before you show your teeth. Correction is not surrender, it is maintenance. If it is unverified, say so, then go find out. In time, even their jokes grew accurate, and accuracy, once a chore, became a point of pride. On the anniversary evening, the lesson moved from talk to emblem, which is how stories become rules in public. The hall filled and then overflowed. Phones rose and then went still. The stage lights burned clear as winter air. Crockett and Leavitt stepped out together, pausing beneath a banner, stitched in bold letters and a stubborn promise. Fierce but factual glowed above them, paired with the translation, "Man me hung fi dua, trensudat." They did not wave. They stood absorbing the quiet that follows a hard-won agreement. Crockett took the microphone and gave the lesson every young lawyer tries to practice and every seasoned voter already knows. "Turn your anger into architecture," she said, and the phrase struck concrete. When you punish, also prevent. When you accuse, also verify. When you correct, match your reach. Hands that have built houses and balance sheets felt the symmetry of that order. Leavitt followed and gave the lesson every rookie needs and every veteran remembers. If you fall, fall forward and carry the cost, she said. Your name is not the wound. Your next act is. She named the moment she said I was wrong, not as heroism, but as housekeeping, and the room understood. She did not ask for pardon. She asked for company in the work of making corrections normal and fast. Together they closed with the sentence that had become both shield and rule. We do not need to be the same in politics, but we need to be the same about the truth. The hall repeated it, not like a chant, but like a safety check before ignition. The message was not sweet, it was sturdy, and sturdiness was what people came to carry home. Under the banner, the image resolved into something nobody could mistake: commitment, where spectacle used to stand. And so the story ended where grown stories should, not with applause, but with a posture. Two figures beneath a promise, a room learning how to breathe patience, and a city practicing new muscle. From an $80 million lawsuit that looked like a weapon, the country built a hinge and turned the door. What began as an attempt at destruction became a blueprint that tightened bolts across the system. The lesson that survived the noise was simple enough to last: truth, first correction, loud, and politics as the hard work of both. From here on, every platform, podium, and pulpit would feel the weight of that change, and American politics, messy, loud, defiant, would run on fiercer debate carried by facts that could stand together. The banner still hung above them, bold and unshaken, fierce but factual. The room was hushed, cameras locked, waiting for what would come next. This was not the end of a story. It was the start of a demand. Crockett leaned forward, her voice carrying the kind of charge that makes people sit straighter. "Don't just watch us," she said, eyes scanning the crowd. "Stand with us. Demand receipts when someone throws accusations. Ask for corrections, not excuses. Truth is not a spectator sport. It's a fight you join." The words hit like a drum, steady and undeniable. Leavitt stepped up beside her, her voice rough but firm. "You don't need to be a politician to make this work. At your kitchen table, in your workplace, online with your friends, challenge what you hear. Say, 'Show me the proof.' Say, 'Fix it if it's wrong.' That's how this becomes bigger than us. That's how we make sure no one else has to crawl through the fire we did." Her tone wasn't pleading, it was daring, a challenge thrown across the room. Together they looked out at the audience, not as rivals, not even as symbols, but as witnesses of what accountability could become. Crockett raised her hand, palm open. "The line is simple. Fierce debate, factual ground. That's the contract." Leavitt echoed, "We can fight over policy tomorrow, but tonight we choose truth." The silence broke into applause that rattled the walls, not because of victory, but because of the call. Now the choice moved from stage to street. The question burned in the air, sharp as a flare. Will you carry the standard, or will you leave it behind? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.